Hello, everybody. It's a pleasure to see all of you, even if I can't quite see you yet, and to welcome you to this session on adaptive management as a centerpiece of effective scaling. I'm Larry Cooley, one of the co-founders of the Community of Practice and moderator for today's session. I want to welcome you all with open arms to what I think is going to be a very stimulating, very exciting session about a topic that's bothered many of us for many years and that I think has become all the more evident with the coronavirus pandemic that we're in the middle of right now. I'll begin by just saying a little bit about the community of practice itself and then transition to the topic of the day. As some of you know who've been with us from the beginning, the community of practice is now 5 years old, and this is our 5th annual workshop. We're now some 700 strong, working in 9 very, very active working groups, as well as a group of the whole. And every year until now, we've managed to get together as a group to try and celebrate what we're doing and also to try and learn from one another. One of the real strengths of that has been the ability to assemble people across sectors, across geographies, and across perspectives to try and talk collectively about what it really means to scale up development outcomes. This year, as you all know, we're having to do this virtually. And I have to say, as much as I missed the opportunity to get together, there is a little bit of a silver lining in it, in that it's been possible for a number of people from faraway places who haven't been able to join us in the past to be part of it this time, and we welcome you all particularly. Not only to this session, but to the community of practice. Any of you who are interested in staying involved, please do so. This is open to everyone. It's free of charge. It's open access, but it's only as strong as its members. So if we're going to have the impact that we want to have and be of value to each other, every voice counts, and we hope yours will be one of them. I'll say just a little bit now, if I could, about those of you who are on the phone today and watching, just so you have a sense as to who's involved in the conversation today. Let me share with you some of the results of the Mentimeter poll that most of you filled out. Steve, could you trigger the first slide? Okay, so let's talk first about who's here. We have people, I'm happy to say, from all around the world. About half are from the US. That's more as a proportion than I wish, but it's less as a proportion than it ever has been for previous events. So I think this is important progress, and noticeably, we have people from every region of the world participating. Then what kind of organizational venues do we come from? Well, about half of you are from NGOs or social enterprises, which is great, because that has not been the case before, where we had, I would say, a domination by donor agencies and researchers, which are still well represented, but I think in what you might call a more appropriate balance than we've been able to have in the past. Next slide. What about the sectors that people come from? Well, we have, as I mentioned before, 9 working groups in this community of practice. Every single one of those working groups is represented on the phone today, which is exactly what we hoped for, and thank you all for being part of it. And again, fulfilling an expectation we had. Almost half of you were not previous members of the community of practice, and we most heartily invite you to join us as we go forward. Thanks so much. Let me now just say a little bit more about the community of practice. Steve, you could take that away if you would. From this, this community of practice, as I mentioned, has got 9 active working groups, 700 or so members. And in addition to annual workshops of the sort we're having right now, one of the things that we've done from the beginning is to have a system of newsletters and also quarterly meetings of the various working groups. So each of the working groups has a meeting typically every quarter, which is either a combination of joint problem solving or sometimes in a webinar format, sharing cases, sharing experience. They're very participatory, as I think will be witnessed by those of you who've been part of it, but to which I would cordially invite any of you who've not been to simply join. There's no entry standard. Anyone who wants to be a member is a member. Then we have newsletters that we issue every quarter as well. We've issued 18 of those. And in those newsletters, we invite all of you to contribute the work that you're doing. And we always have several special features. The next newsletter, for example, will include a summary of the events that are taking place this week and next. And a new feature of the Community of Practice, we're just about to launch a website, which is timed to coincide with the end of this Community of Practice meeting on the 30th of October, and which will include not only results of all of these meetings, but also pages for each one of the 9 working groups with their past work, with opportunities for people to post both information, job openings, needs, and we hope a very lively exchange of views about the issues that we're all dealing with. Could you post a slide on that? So for those of you who want to jot this down, that's going to be the address of the website. Again, it's not live until October 30th, but it will be live then. www.scalingcommunityofpractice, all one word, .com. And if any of you are interested in joining the Community of Practice or want to correspond with one of us, you could just send an email to scalingcop@msi-inc.com. So let me now just turn, first of all, to a little bit of introduction of the subject before I introduce our star-studded panel. Let me, if I could, set the scene for you just a little bit. So for those of you who've been working on scaling alongside us for a while, you'll know that the issue of adaptive management or flexible implementation and learning by doing, all of those words have now become very common in the vocabulary. It's not unusual now to hear people talk the talk, but for a number of reasons that we're going to explore, it's much less common to see people walk the walk. And trying to figure out why that is at the core of this panel. We're going to try to, we think we understand much better than we did a few years ago what some of the obstacles are. And luckily, we also think we see some ways forward illustrated by examples of people who've managed to overcome those obstacles and do exactly the kind of work that we're talking about. To give you a sense of what I think we're overcoming in this, I would say that there were initially 2 very powerful obstacles, one of which I'm happy to say is no longer the obstacle it once was, but one of which remains, I think, a formidable obstacle. The one, let me start with the good news. The one that used to be a big problem, and I would say with some enthusiasm is not anymore, is the technical feasibility of generating information, sharing information, analyzing information in ways that make it possible for people to use that information to make real-time changes. If you go back, turn your minds back, those of you who are old enough to do so, to what we were dealing with before, it was typically annual reporting. It was usually budget cycles, annual budget cycles that we were working against. The deep learning was usually periodic evaluations, maybe a midterm in a project or at the end of a project. Now we see lots of cases of real-time information, and I really mean real-time information where this is not just getting generated, but getting analyzed, used, and fed back. And simultaneously, the number of people who can be included is no longer the people who can fit into a small conference room. It's the number of people who can really participate in these virtual fora. We're seeing this now supercharged during the COVID period. So that problem, the feasibility problem, simply is not the obstacle that it once was. But we're left with a second problem. The second problem is institutional incentives and legacy systems. And I think I can give you a feel for that one if you look inside the term adaptive management. For many of us, a synonym for adaptation is flexibility. And I think you'll be hard pressed to find anyone who's against flexibility or anyone who advocates non-adaptive management. But think about it the other way. The flip side of flexibility is discretion. And if there's flexibility in the system, it means you're giving someone the authority, the power to go ahead and make a decision that was not the decision that was originally made through this whole bureaucratic process. That kind of delegation of authority or the ability to give discretion to people to make decisions makes large bureaucratic systems crazy. because it runs straight into not only their perquisites, but it runs into their sense of their need to steward public funds and to ensure accountability. So if you see that side of it as well as the other side, you begin to realize why it's easier to talk the talk sometimes than it is to walk the walk. Some of you will know this term CLA, collaboration, learning, and adaptation. It means we're doing much better at the collaboration and the learning than we are at the adaptation. So that's the issue that we really want to explore today, trying to understand both what those obstacles are, how we can confront them, and hopefully some examples of people who've done that successfully. Now, let me just close that circle by relating it back to scaling. Scaling is by its nature a longish term activity with a lot of complexity that involves systems change. All of those things require adaptation. I can honestly tell you that having worked at this for a long time, I've never seen one, not one, that played out the way it originally intended. There were adjustments along the way, intended, unintended, predictable, unpredictable, but a constantly circuitous course. Don't adapt, don't survive. We had earlier this week, Ed Mabaya quoted back to us something from Darwin that I think is very apt. He said, the future doesn't belong to those who are strongest, it belongs to those who adapt best. And I think that's true in scaling. So we're going to look at that today from three different perspectives. First, we're going to look at a set of cases that are drawn from our Fragile States Working Group. And this has to do with the situations where adaptation is absolutely understandable to everybody. You're in turbulent environments, often conflict or famine, and somehow you have to do programming that adapts to that. So we're going to hear from Alistair McKechnie and from Rob Chase about two aspects of that. Alistair about the general situation involving fragile states and conflict, and Rob speaking specifically about the pandemic and responses to that. Then we're going to turn to our social enterprise working group, Elaine Tinsley and Adanma Abdulunam. And we're going to look at what that means when you're talking about social enterprise, another legendarily adaptive enterprise. And again, we'll look at how they adapted all the time, but also how they specifically adapted to COVID. And then finally, we're going to try to close that loop by coming back to what you might call more conventional development situations, listening to Michelle Adams-Matson and Nejma Koval, talking about how we can actually take the lessons of adaptive management and apply them when there is no war, when there is no conflict, when there is no famine in this, but where we're trying to do scaling that needs that adaptation equally. So that's our sequence for today. Let me now turn briefly to the format, and then I'll introduce the panelists. So we'd like to, I'm making this in a very sort of direct presentational sort of format, but we're going to quickly pivot to something that I hope will feel to you much more informal, like you're inviting us into your living rooms or we inviting you into ours. And we're going to do this in as conversational a way as we can. I want you all to make aggressive use of the chat box. That's for two reasons. One, we'll respond to as many of the questions and comments as we possibly can. And secondly, after the event, we're going to collect those and see how we can best engage them as a community of practice going forward. We can't do that if you don't participate. This is just like voting. It's not a spectator sport. If you hear anything that provokes you, if you have a question, don't be shy. Please, please, please put it into the chat box. And then a couple of times during the course of the next hour and a half, we're going to pause and specifically ask you for input on a couple of questions because we think that will help us advance as a group. All right, let me now introduce the panelists. First, Alistair McKechnie. Alistair is a senior research associate at ODI, the Overseas Development Institute in London. And for those of you who don't know him, for many years and for many venues, he's advised a variety of organizations on aid and aid management, right where the nexus occurs between fragility, conflict, and development. He was for 28 years at the World Bank, including serving as director of the Fragile and Conflict Affected Countries Group, and he was country director for Afghanistan. He's done a whole bunch of other relevant things, including co-chairing the OECD task team on state building in fragile states, and he's a founding member of this CLP's working group on scaling up in fragile states. Rob Chase, who co-chairs that working group that I just mentioned, is practice manager for social protection and jobs in the World Bank's East Africa region. In that role, Rob's responsible for a portfolio that supports vulnerable people and promotes resilience with social safety nets and with jobs programs. Prior to joining the bank, he was a member of the economics faculty at Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies, where he coordinated the development economics program. Elaine Tinsley is a private sector specialist at the World Bank. Her work focuses on creating better enabling conditions for scaling social enterprises, particularly through public policy and public-private collaboration. She has a whole string of publications, but a couple of the most relevant are Reaching the Last Mile, Social Enterprise Business Models for Inclusive Development, and most recently, Results-Based Financing Through Social Enterprises, the Response to the COVID-19 Pandemic. Elaine co-leads the Social Enterprise Working Group of the Community of Practice. Adanma Abalunam is an engagement director at the Busara Center for Behavioral Economics in Lagos, Nigeria. I'll have her tell you a bit more about that. But at Busara, she manages a broad portfolio of projects in early childhood development, family planning, WASH, and financial inclusion. And for those of you, again, who don't know Busara's work, in the behavioral economics field, it combines capacity building, lab experimentation, and strategic communications to support iterative design and scaling of a wide range of innovations. Prior to joining Busara, Adanma worked as a project manager for large-scale DFID economic growth projects in Nigeria that pioneered the use of adaptive management at scale. Now turning to the Monitoring and Evaluation Working Group. Michelle Adams-Matson is my colleague at Management Systems International, where she leads the strategy, evaluation, and analysis practice. An expert in strategic planning and results-based management, she's worked with a wide variety of international and local organizations to help them plan and implement programs in rapidly evolving environments. Most recently, Michelle led MSI's ideation pivot team to quickly adapt to the COVID-19 context. And finally, but definitely not least, Nejma Koval Saifi. Nejma is founder and CEO of Integrated International, a successful M&E consulting firm located in Amman, Jordan, and focused on a wide range of issues related to monitoring, evaluation, and most prominently learning, with a particular focus on evidence-based decision-making, especially related to education and youth. She's been a pioneer in helping the government of Jordan adapt innovations to their classroom, curriculum, and blended learning approaches, and most recently to the COVID-19's uncertainties. She was an invited fellow from the Global South at last year's annual workshop on the scaling of the Scaling COP. It's an incredibly distinguished panel. I feel really privileged to be able to chair it. And now let's just jump right in. I'm going to start with a question to Alistair, if I might. Hey, Alistair, you've spent a career, as I think a lot of us now know, working in and on difficult places. Is there something about that, you think you've learned about the best practices of donors in trying to deal with, adapt, and do programming in those sorts of locations that might be relevant for our conversation about scaling?
Thanks, Larry, and thank you to you and your team for organizing this workshop. I'm really privileged to be invited to participate on this distinguished panel. As Larry suggested, my career has been a series of accidents when I tended to land in the most difficult places at what turned out to be the right times. Because of the huge risks from countries returning to conflict, I've been required to find ways of achieving early results at scale. Small, well-intentioned projects that were not scalable were simply not sufficient to deal with these problems of avoiding conflict and accelerating development in some of the poorest parts of the world. To answer your question, though, let's start with what we mean by fragility and how international partners can help support transitions to resilience. The first point is that fragility comes from degraded institutions that lead to a loss of public trust in their legitimacy, their ability to embody an inclusive sense of nation, mediate differences, and deliver services. Countries or regions affected by fragility can have high risks of conflict or experience actual violence. Secondly, the transition from fragility to resilience involves the transformation of institutions and the society they represent. Sustaining change requires deep roots within organizations and needs to become institutionalized rather than relying on just a few champion individuals. Eliminating the risk of conflict requires a bold vision of scale. But institutional transformation involves political change that almost always is homegrown. A rebalancing of the constellation of political and coercive power and the distribution of economic rents. Such change usually takes place incrementally unless a civil war, revolution, or other crisis has created a window of opportunity, and it takes place through local political processes. Outside partners can influence these local processes, both positively and negatively, but cannot determine them. Even the most technocratic interventions can empower or disempower incumbent authority and its challenges, and can have unanticipated consequences. Support that is highly projectized and which bypasses local institutions can take away opportunities for them to learn and to be accountable for delivery. It is not sustainable without continuing foreign aid and can hold back the development of local capacity needed to achieve scale. Sometimes it's almost impossible for outsiders to understand the internal political dynamics, particularly when they are informal and linked to tribal, kinship, criminal, and other networks. This is particularly so when partners are re-engaging in a country after a crisis and lack experience or knowledge of the country's circumstances. In terms of what international partners can do and approaches that seem to work, the first I would mention is that at ODI, the horrible name, problem-driven iterative adaptation, commonly called PDIA approach, has been used a lot in fragile situations. This allows partners to facilitate institutional change through working with counterparts to identify and solve problems that the country believes to be critical and solvable. This requires the partner to act flexibly and to exploit opportunities as they arise. In other words, adaptive management. What ends up getting done, as Larry suggested in his opening remarks, may be quite different from what was originally planned. How then, though, can we reconcile plodding incremental change with the vision of scale needed to achieve resilience and to prevent war? One way is to connect the two with a theory of change. This sets out a pathway for getting from here to there and the critical assumptions that underpin actions today, which lead to results at scale, if not tomorrow, over a period of years. These assumptions should be testable to allow the program to be adjusted as preliminary results come in. In other words, adaptive management. Thank you, Barry.
Yeah, Alistair, let me follow up if I could with a direct question on this. I think you make a compelling case for why it's important, maybe necessary, to take this sort of approach. But I know from my own experience, and I've heard you talk from yours, about just how hard this is for donors to accommodate themselves to that. So remembering your longtime hat at the World Bank and the other perspectives you've had on this, how do you thread the needle between the need for adaptation and the sort of penchant or the requirement for predictability?
Well, as you mentioned before, responding to the challenge of fragility and applying techniques such as PDIA and theories of change require flexibility to adjust programs that evolve over time as conditions change. And these conditions are partly unknown when the program is approved. The ability to manage programs adaptively, as you already have pointed out, requires delegation of authority to staff who are close to the information. And this means that managers have to appoint staff of high quality, and they need to be able to trust them and let them act autonomously. Now, I mean, this may sound difficult in some bureaucracies. I know at the World Bank, we were actually quite decentralized and managed to do this. I mean, if you don't have the right people, you start off with a problem. The second issue, and I think you've also indicated, is shifting to flexible programming with uncertain outcomes, managed through delegation to staff with autonomy, often acting in countries perceived, as I put in quotation marks, corrupt, is in direct contradiction to the trend for tighter accountability and fiduciary control. How to resolve this? I see four approaches. First, as my friend Charles Kinney at the Center for Global Development has written, a shift from focusing on inputs and donor processes towards financing outcomes or results that can achieve scale. In other words, a move away from projects towards multi-year programs and to financing results, as Charles had put it, not receipts. This does not mean that a partner should be indifferent to its funds going astray and not take decisive action when these events take place. I mean, the credibility of international partners, donors, and so on depends on some, fiduciary accountability. Second, greater integration of stakeholders that go beyond the government and the foreign partner is needed into all stages: program design, implementation, and particularly oversight. For example, community and service user organizations, civil society organizations, and the private and non-profit sector. Third point I'd make is better use of data collection and analysis to measure change and provide information to determine whether the program's assumptions are valid, and most importantly, it is on track to deliver results. I hesitate to call this good monitoring and evaluation, as this phrase I think is somewhat shop-worn, but it could involve greater use of the new technologies to collect and interpret data, as well as randomized controlled trials. And fourth, more use of independent external evaluators to produce periodic assessments, rather than the current deluge of monthly reports, which are often produced pro forma and rarely read. You might think that all this sounds great, but I think why would governments and donors, multilateral financiers change? And I would argue there are several drivers at work. One is the protracted crises that have stressed the humanitarian system and which require greater emphasis on conflict prevention and localized solution. The second is the competition from new international partners, especially China. Third is competition from private finance. And fourth is the growing recognition that conflict prevention is a global public good and needs more effective action. Crises that appear far away, as we have seen, can have far-reaching effects such as refugees, trafficking, drugs, transnational crime, terrorism, and so on. And I think these drivers push governments to want effectiveness at scale and to better balance fiduciary risks with the risks of failure to achieve outputs or underwhelming results, and to prevent the catastrophic consequences of armed conflict. Thank you, Larry.
Thank you very much for a very interesting and very thoughtful kind of response to a hard question. Rob, I'm going to ask you to pick up where Alistair left off. You could equally, I could have directed exactly the same question to you that I directed to him, but I want you to build on it in the context of COVID as well, because I know you've been in the middle of that.
Yeah, thanks, Larry. And First of all, thanks for asking me to join this panel. It's great to be working with such prestigious folks who are working on the same issues. And just a shameless plug as the new co-chair of the Fragile States Working Group 1 week from today, my co-chair Jonathan and I will be hosting a discussion where we hope we can build on some of the themes we talk about today. At the World Bank, as Larry said, I'm the practice manager for social protection and jobs for East Africa. And as many of you know, the World Bank has governments as clients. And so when I saw a fair proportion of this group being people from the NGO communities, there's in some ways different scaling up challenges that we face, but it's always challenging in FCV context. And what we need to be doing is having these types of conversations about the best ways to link the lessons that are being learned from those who work more closely with governments and those who are trying more innovative approaches in other ways. The specific space that my team works on, and I cover from Sudan to Mozambique, is the working on shock responsive safety nets. And so we're right at the sort of core of trying to build that bridge between humanitarian actors and longer term development actors, but the particular approach that I bring to it as a career as an academic and also as a development professional is about some of the points that Larry said at the outset. And there's this conundrum about the delegation, wanting to delegate, but also needing to have accountability. And I think that figuring out how to deal with that conundrum is the, in my mind, key to scaling up and scaling up well. Part of how we're doing it, and this relates exactly to what Alistair just said, and Alistair, I'm pleased to follow you, that we need to think in some ways about flipping some of the accountability dialogue or way we think about accountability to focus on accountability to beneficiaries and to achieving specific results. And Charles Kenny also speaks a lot to that. And I think that's an exciting and important way to think about what we should be doing. Now, switching to your question, Larry, the COVID situation is obviously a world-changing event that we're all grappling with, and it's an unprecedented set of challenges. I'm speaking particularly to the challenges that my country partners and clients in East Africa are dealing with. And as you may be aware, there is not as big a caseload in COVID, at least reported, parentheses, we're not sure whether or not that's because of testing or the lack of public health systems to keep track of those cases. But the big issues that we're dealing with in a deep crisis at the moment are the locust crisis, the largest locust infestation in a century, and an economic downturn where the first recession in 25 years is hitting the Africa region as a whole. We're going to expect to see 40 million new people fall back into poverty, i.e. we've lost 5 years worth of progress in the last 6 months. Now, in that context, there's been a huge push from lots of actors and government actors in East Africa to put in place shock responsive cash transfer or social protection systems. 46 countries have put in place 186 new programs, and that's growing. That's as of mid-September, that's growing every day. So some of the lessons that my team and the World Bank, and working with some of the people who I hope are on the call who are in the field from NGOs and other donor agencies that we've learned, none of this is particularly new. It's wisdom that we knew was true about thinking about forward-looking systems. So how do you put together forward-looking systems to provide just-in-time cash transfers? Well, you need to register people. You need to know who people are. You need to have ID systems for people. You have to have clear communications to citizens about what they are eligible for and what they're not eligible for. You have to have payment systems in place. And that sort of call to be ready for a crisis of any sort is age-old wisdom, but it is still very, very relevant today. Now, another lesson that we're learning already is the possibilities that are very exciting about using digital technologies to address some of these needs for flexible forward-looking systems, by which I'm talking about ID systems that are digital, the potential for payments that are cashless, and all of that is going to be vitally, or will be vitally important in a context where you can't do high-touch activities, you can't go door to door. But the problem, of course, is that digital techniques are not a panacea. That there are all sorts of really complicated and thorny issues about, for instance, data privacy, or how do you make sure there's adequate inclusion on trying to use these digital approaches, and we're all trying to work together on those. The bottom line is that having prior planning is always going to be useful, and you can have that prior planning as a framework that allows for greater flexibility. I can speak to a couple of examples, one of which is Malawi. For 15 years, we've been working on a cash transfer system that in the last 6 months was urgently asked to operate in urban areas, because traditional safety net recipients are in rural areas, and food insecure folks. Informal sector workers in urban areas are being asked in Malawi. We're putting together in fast-paced systems to try to reach urban area potential cash transfer recipients in Malawi. But those need for forward-looking systems, digital payments, and also prior planning falls into place absolutely in the Malawi case. I'll stop there.
Thanks. You know, one of the things that's really clear in listening to you is that, driven by necessity, people are finding ways to make fairly quick pivots in these systems. And it's exactly what those of us in the scaling business have come to feel is necessary to make those sorts of things. Do you have a sense as to why the bank or others are more willing to do that in situations like the ones we find ourselves in now than they were prior to that? Do you think it's that the need for it isn't fully appreciated in other situations, or just that necessity is the mother of invention?
I mean, I think that absolutely necessity is the mother of invention. I think that also the World Bank, like many of us, are recognizing that if you're focusing on trying to eliminate global poverty, fragility and fragile states are one of the locations where we're going to need to figure out how to do these types of things. I want to give a quick example from this morning, in fact, where this morning the World Bank signed a $400 million program in Sudan. And you will have known that over the last year, there's been an amazing transition in Sudan from a very difficult past. And in that setup, the new transitional government is marvelously cosmopolitan. I know that half of the population, half of this group is from North America, but there may have been a member of the Yang Gang. That is to say, there was a push to try to do a UBI to reach 80% of the population of Sudan, with a program that would be expensive. To reach 80% of the population would cost on a yearly basis $2 billion, but that would save $4 billion from the subsidies that are currently in place. Now, Sudan this type of program has never been done in the history of the planet, and certainly not in a place like Sudan. And so what we had to do was put together, to use another cliche, we needed to build the plane as we were flying. We put together a financing package that the one that we signed today was for $400 million. And from that, we will then leverage more and more monies as Sudan gets closer and closer to being out of arrears. The message from this is that my team, the World Bank teams, did just what Alistair was saying. We had to put people in the field. There was an immense degree of delegation. That delegation was based on shared vision about what needs to be done, the imperative to do something quickly and to do something innovative, obviously the adrenaline of trying to do something that's never been done before.
And large.
But we also, and on a massive scale, Mongolia and Iran had done UBI, universal basic incomes, but they had a different financing situation with resources at hand. Bottom line, team in the field needed to have delegation. The senior management, by which I mean all the governors of the World Bank and the management of the World Bank, needed to feel comfortable with new ways of operating. and needed to recognize that this high risk, high reward effort was worth doing. We built a program that is based on results and are given a great deal of flexibility to try to reach those results, but also the key piece behind, I think, much of it was a trust that all actors in this were serving the same goal of trying to serve, be accountable to the beneficiaries in Sudan. And with that, I drop back to my first point, which is to think about accountability in terms of results to the beneficiaries, and flexibility and trust to do so is some of the key messages. I'll stop there. Thanks.
I want to challenge all of us on the call today to think about the models that Alistair and Rob were just describing, where clearly in the face of necessity, the donor system found ways to make accommodations and innovations in the way we deliver that involve exactly the kind of adaptive management that we're arguing is necessary for successful scaling. How come if we can do it there, we can't do it in our more conventional development settings? I want to keep us, to the extent we can, focused on that issue as we move forward. And let me turn now to the second, what I think is solid proof point on this, which is social enterprises. I'm going to turn to Elaine Tinsley on this to talk about what we've learned in looking at the adaptability, the necessary adaptability of social enterprises. And I know, Elaine, you've also been involved in the super adaptability during the COVID situation. But I'm interested in anything you think we can take away from that, not about how they do it, but what we could learn from it and how we can basically mimic some of that adaptability in what we do and also be supportive of them as they do it.
Okay, thanks very much, Larry. I think you're correct, completely correct that with social enterprises, it's really within their DNA to be adaptable. And when I was looking at your questions, it's pretty much our session next week covers this in detail, because it really is about how do social enterprises respond to COVID, and also how do they adapt to it. Because on the one hand, they need to respond to COVID, they want to respond to COVID, and sometimes they're one of the first players there, because either governments have been too slow to come in or are too overwhelmed to come in. So they're the ones who came in immediately. For example, in India, when they stopped the when they pushed migrant workers back into the rural areas, there was no plans for like how these people were going to be fed, how they were going to be transported. So you had these huge, massive outflows, but no one was taking care of them. So you had social enterprises that had stepped in like goons and to provide food packets for these people. So they quickly responded to it, but at the same time, they also have to maintain their own operations too. So you also have other social enterprises that are coming in and say, we're not in the health or the water and sanitation, which is the one where the focus of new funding is going towards. How do we also manage our operations to adjust to these market conditions, changing conditions? So, but if you look at the first one, the social enterprises that are responding to COVID, how have they done it, and what have they done, and how can they be supported? A lot of them are actually stretching how they're stretching themselves, right? But they're also doing it with collaboration. So within our session next week, we actually have one of the social enterprises coming in to talk about how they responded to the health crisis in the slums in Kenya and Kibera with the last mile pharmacy Access Afya. And I think it's interesting to see, because they worked with other social enterprises and other NGOs and also funders to be able to come up with a platform to increase awareness of the dangers of COVID. Because that was one of the most critical things that you could do is, first, you need to increase awareness. Second, you also need to improve the health response to it. And you also have to have the infrastructure and sanitation things. So you see different social enterprises taking parts in different aspects of the response to COVID. And it's one of the key things I think with social enterprises is that they have the trust of the communities, because they're on the ground. Like Alistair and Rob were talking about, you need to be responsive to the beneficiaries. How do you be responsive to the beneficiaries? And I think with social enterprises, because they're already on the grounds, they already have ties to the communities, they're already providing services to it, they understand what works. And they're able to provide information to the community on the ground that is trustworthy. I mean, even in the United States, we understand how misinformation how easy it is to do misinformation. So in other less educated areas, this can be even more vital, right? So the fact that they can push forth these correct information, make it easily accessible, have hotlines for people to access, was actually quite critical in it. So I think one of the key things was the ability to first adapt their models to actually respond, right? To take advantage of the assets that they had, the networks that they had to be able to respond to COVID. Other things that we've seen social enterprises do is to improve the quality of the health clinics, to be able to take in those protocols that they needed to take in. So there's so many different ways that social enterprises have come in that it's actually good to see that, but you can actually get better scale if you're more coordinated with the government. And I think this is the part where it's been a little bit less. Social enterprises have been very active with donors and funders, less so maybe with the governments. Some have, that's not to say that they haven't. But if we can improve that tie a little bit more so that when you do have these crises and these pandemics, the governments know that these are players that they can count on to help deliver services and activities to the population and to move quickly. And then the second aspect of the social enterprise adaptation is how do you deal with your business model, right? Because a lot of them are working with their with the clients. All of a sudden you have a shock in supply chains, you have a shock in demand. How do you stay in business so that you can actually continue providing services and to the poor? And so I think this is another thing that we're looking at within our session. We're looking at the resilience, how to make social enterprises more resilient so that they can survive on the other side of the social enterprise, of the pandemic. And so I think one of the things you look at is like internally, what is it that they need to do internally? How is it that they work with their personnel, make sure that their personnel stays safe? Another one is how do you deal with the shift in markets? How do you deal with the shift in market demand that's exogenous, which is out of their control? And then also, how do you improve their resilience? What is the steps that can happen to make them more resilient? And I think this is also where donors can also come in and funders to be able to say, we can be more flexible on metrics that need to happen, and also to see, be flexible on metrics and also on the milestones, and also to change it quickly, because we have to understand that it is a tough time, and you do want accountability, like Alistair said. I mean, it's a trade-off between accountability and outcomes. But at the end of the day, I think what you also find is reputation too, right? If it's a social enterprise that has a strong reputation, it's easier to say, okay, we can adjust our metrics because we know that you have it in your business, and you have a track record of actually serving the poor and helping the poor succeed. And that's actually quite important when you need to move quickly to respond, but at the same time, you want to make sure that you get the results that come out.
And as you deal with the donor side of this, trying to match the flexibility and the pivots that are taking place within social enterprises themselves, what's your current feeling about how optimistic we should be about donors' ability to accommodate that? Because I just speak from my own experience on this. I think we do so much better at talking the talk than walking the walk on this issue, because our own systems are just not built for that level of flexibility. And my question is whether you see in the current situation, or just in the dealing with social enterprise more generally, a different way of doing development assistance emerging that perhaps we could ride the backs of in some of the scaling work, or the same kind of rigidities that many of us rail against in conventional development programming?
I think with respect to that, one of the key ways to address that is actually the M&E system. And this has been raised a little bit by Alistair and Rob as well, because if you have a good M&E system that has shown that you can track your results and can go forward and also track your results too, then it allows you to improve the flexibility of it. And right now, I think with social enterprises, I mean, they do try to put in, those that put in good M&E systems are more likely to get better funding. But also we're looking at results-based financing, and it's much easier when you do have a good M&E system to be able to quickly track. And then this way, it's actually beneficial for social enterprises as well too, because then they know how to pivot their models. But it's expensive to also put in a good system. And I think this is where donors can actually and governments can actually be a little bit more proactive in being able to help set up M&E systems that they don't put the burden necessarily fully on the social enterprises.
That's a very thoughtful
but
response.
It's actually giving them the funding to actually be able to do that. I know
Thanks.
before, when we did like development marketplace, where we were supporting a bunch of social enterprises, we also had a budget component for their grant that was actually for capacity building. But likewise, it should also be for monitoring and evaluation, so that these things can be
Yeah.
done quickly and then you can respond fast on it.
Well, I can tell you just, and this is a perfect transition to Adanma on this, but I can tell you that having talked with and worked with a lot of local NGOs and social enterprises, what looks to the donors like a capacity problem often looks to them like a resource problem. So they'll be told they don't have adequate M&E capacity or financial management capacity, and they'll answer, I think, very credibly, of course not. If we had the resources to hire the people we need or to build the systems that we require, we would have that capacity. It's not that we don't know how, it's that we're under-resourced in that regard.
And I think for them, it's a trade-off, right? Between
It is
having
absolutely a
the
trade-off.
operations versus setting up the overhead and the admin part of it. So this is
Donna, let me use that as the pivot to you if I could on this. I mean, your work in Nigeria and beyond is clearly trying to get clients, private sector and public sector, to do this sort of iterative, evidence-based design, to recognize that they've got to learn from the experience of doing things in order to make that happen. Tell people just a tiny bit about the Busara Center, because I'm not sure some of the people on the phone would know much about it, but then say what you think you've learned about how to get clients to really credibly incorporate that into what they do and recognize that as an important way to move forward.
Sure. So I think, yeah, I'll start with a brief introduction to Busara. The Busara Center for Behavioral Economics has been operational since 2013 when we launched simply as an academic center offering lab and testing services to academics who were interested in doing research, lab-based research in the Global South. We've since grown to have offices across East Africa and then in Nigeria and in India currently. So our work was initially very much academic facing. And I think 2 years into Busara's lifetime, there was some thinking around how we could take some of the insights that we were building on questions such as poverty and stress and how they affect decision making, and apply that to policy making, decision making, both in the private sector and across social enterprises, to improve the way that interventions were being designed and the degree to which they addressed the behavioral biases and preferences of their target audiences. So a lot of that work was initially with the financial sector. We found that given sort of like the immediate iterative development and retooling of products, that they were very open to doing sort of rapid iterative research on what was successful with their customer base and what was not. We've since grown to do, we now work with a number of different partners in a large range of sectors. So a lot of my work is in agriculture, early childhood development. We still have a large financial sector portfolio, but we've been doing a lot of work increasingly in governance and are also trying to develop some of our thinking and some of our concepts and understanding of how behavioral science might also be applicable to questions of fragility and resilience. And so to your question about how we are able to work with partners iteratively and sort of encourage adaptive management. Initially, a lot of Busara's work happened either at the beginning of a project, so design an intervention, identify some biases, identify mechanisms that might unlock those biases, and then roll out the program at scale, which obviously was an improvement in how some projects were running, but potentially problematic because then again, we weren't really allowing for adaptiveness in the course of implementation. And so a product or a type of partnership that we've developed over the past few years is something that we call learning partnerships. And what we do there is that we enter into multi-year arrangements with nonprofits or donors in which we build testing, additional research into the design of the program. And we find that developing that partnership at the outset makes partners so much more willing to come back to us over the course of the project to feedback what they're finding in the field and work with us to develop a new agenda for testing and rollout.
And does that include governments also?
We haven't done much work to direct to government. I think that's a part of our portfolio that we're still trying to build. We do work with government through donors quite a bit. So for instance, at the moment in Kenya, we're working with the government to develop, we're working through a funder with the government to develop the rollout of the HPV vaccine for adolescent girls. And so in that sense, we are working with the Ministry of Health and associated agencies. And obviously that means that sort of the bureaucracies and the challenges of adaptive management creep in there. But yeah, typically not currently offering services directly to government.
And if you were going to pinpoint the most vexing challenge in trying to get people to buy into this mindset and way of interacting, what would you say it is?
For me, it's been the perspective that adaptive management is a strain on resources. So that's both time and finances. What we've really had to counter is this perception that doing good adaptive management requires very expensive M&E, very expensive tools for consistently and iteratively tracking progress. And I think that the only real way to do that is to work with organizations and entities to show them that there are very nimble non-outsiders that you do have to convince them from the outset to work with you. So it's, yeah, it's a piecemeal change, I think, in how people think about adaptive management, but something that I think we're seeing some clear improvements in.
Yep, I hope somebody asks you a question about that, because I think that's a really important thing for us to explore. It's also a perfect pivot to the conversation about monitoring and evaluation, where I'm going to turn to Michelle and then to Nejma. So we've heard now so far about fragile states, the special case of COVID, and social enterprises and the private sector, all of which for one reason or another have no choice but to be adaptive, and donors to a greater or lesser extent have found a way to adapt along with them. I think the challenge for the rest of us is to figure out why we've had so much trouble crosswalking that to the situation of scaling in places that don't suffer from that level of fragility. And when we're working with official scaling channels, governments and large scale donors and so on. And I want to ask Michelle and then Nejma to help us get underneath that question a little bit. Michelle, let me start with a question to you, which is that, I mean, I know you've been pushing on this adaptive management for a long time with what most of us would think of as mainstream donors on this. Why do you think it's so hard to do?
Well, we've been working on incorporating adaptive management as part of an intentional strategy for tackling development problems. And I think it has a lot to do with some of the things you already mentioned. You know, we think there are some important lessons that are worth highlighting. In this case, I think you've talked about sort of this tension between accountability and adaptability. So, you know, adaptive management is an idea that most of us can easily embrace in principle, but there's a variety of reasons it can be challenging in practice. And so that, as you've kind of pointed out, in the battle between accountability and adaptability, accountability usually wins. But having said that, I also believe that there's often much more adaptability than people realize or avail themselves of. And building adaptability brings another dimension to the planning process and to M&E that we need to think about.
Yeah, and do you have lessons where you think people have, notwithstanding those constraints, really done interesting things?
Yeah, let me talk about a couple of things. You know, one thing is that I think adaptive management is becoming more important and it's essential for scaling. And you and I have talked about a couple of these factors. One thing is the complexity of development work. There's a recognition that the type of political, economic, and social changes sought in development don't take place in a vacuum. They're inherently complex changes that take place in the context of interrelated systems. And over the last 10 years or so, organizations have acknowledged this, and we see it in the emergence in ideas like resilience, systems thinking, complexity aware monitoring, or collaborating, learning, and adapting. And that simply means that there are limits to what is known in early planning, and adaptive approaches better reflect that reality. And second, and this is important as well, is I think development is undergoing a transformation that contributes to this complexity. So in the world of conventional donor programming, official development assistance has become a smaller portion of financial flows to developing countries. So in the 1960s, private capital comprised 29% of financial flows. And by 2013, private sources accounted for 84% of all financial flows to developing countries and 91% for the US. And all of this means that there are a number of forces outside of our control when planning and designing projects. There's more actors, there's more sources of funding, and there's more models for development. And finally, COVID-19 has only amplified these trends and the need for adaptability. The pandemic has created an environment where everybody is learning in real time. So I think there's some important lessons worth highlighting. One is because everybody's learning at the same time, the pandemic has created an openness to exploring new ideas and more flexible approaches. And that creates real opportunities to integrate adaptive management. Second, I think that trying to find adaptive solutions also means addressing the management and decision-making ecosystem. And I'd say there's 4 important factors to consider. One is that leadership has to be committed to adaptive management and the value of adaptive management. Some of the panelists talked about that. Second, the most robust approaches are based on developing continuous sensing and response capability. So it's not just about developing one plan, but how will managers get the right information on an ongoing basis? And then adaptive approaches require clarity about how decision-making will take place in response to new information. That's important. And then finally, I think it's important to create space to process information in a collaborative manner. But I don't want to leave the discussion without providing you with a practical example for how this can be done. So let me just give you one. In Colombia, we came up with a system that we call rapid iterative learning. And after the government signed the peace agreement, we required a way to gather information and make decisions more quickly on the implementation of that peace agreement. So in that case, we created an adaptive approach and shortened the learning cycle from several months to 4 or 5 weeks. And we did this by identifying a small number of learning questions. They were very practical and focused on critical priorities. We quickly researched these questions by synthesizing multiple streams of analysis, and then we conducted a series of workshops to process the information with seasoned technical expertise and key stakeholders. So that resulted in a set of actions and allowed the team to identify the next round of questions to answer. So it occurred in a cycle. So that just gives you a practical example.
It's a great case, actually, and I think again, thank you all for being so helpful in giving me transitions between these conversations. That's a perfect handoff to Nejma on this, because here's Nejma right in the middle of another such case in Jordan. Again, Nejma, do what I know you will do, which is to take a field perspective, but I think a very particular kind of field perspective, in that you sort of sit astride this discussion between donors and countries and implementing bodies. In a sense, you've got a foot in both camps on both of these things. It's very much a local organization and valued as such by the Jordanian government, but also as a trusted partner on the donor side. Give us a little bit of a feel for the cross currents that apply in this situation, and any insights you think you can draw from that.
Sure. Thank you, Larry. It's a privilege to return to the scaling community of practice and participate on this panel representing the Global South. As Larry noted, I'm the CEO of Integrated International based in Jordan and covering the MENA region. We specialize in monitoring, evaluation, and learning, as well as innovation, where we use our MEL-Quals to test technological innovations in labor and education, and where we find statistical significance of pilot solutions. We work hand in hand with government and donors with the aim to scale. And we've been working on scaling one particular solution in early grade Arabic literacy with the Ministry of Education in Jordan for about the last 6 years. So you posed a great question, Larry, because there's so many challenges and opportunities on both sides of working with donors and with government. Donors generally have rigorous evidence standards related to key outcomes, which align with reform efforts of government. So it's a great opportunity to create an evidence base and a pathway that can speak to how best to scale. However, donor timelines are usually shorter than the time required to scale, which according to the scaling community of practice is 15 years. So it sometimes becomes difficult to achieve the vision of the reform put forth by government on a donor timeline. On the other hand, in a crisis like COVID, the government needs to pivot immediately and doesn't have the luxury to stop and think of a longer term vision or reform at the height of a crisis. And so in that point in time, an evidence base is not going to be its priority, as it would be within a longer term reform effort, and stopgap measures are sought instead. And so within our experiences in working with the government of Jordan and scaling EdTech, we've been able to pivot regularly due to a continuous dedication to testing and adapting. And so our evidence-based pivots have enabled us to move from controlled trial and pilot to program, to adapt to strengthen programming, to increase uptake in the classroom, to build momentum and buy-in, and adapt to the current COVID delivery mechanisms. In our next pivots, we also aim to engage parents at home and enable teachers to engage with their students remotely while they work from home. The advantage to working in monitoring and evaluation is that as new elements or iterations get introduced to scaling, there's an evolution from product, and in this case, EdTech product in the control trial, to a program that is institutionalized, meaning that it's owned, embedded, and delivered by the Ministry of Education across all early grades in schools and classrooms in the country. So we're in the process of creating an evidence-based journey map that can track this evolution, that could support a longer-term vision for both donors and governments. We're approaching our 7th year. We're approaching our 3rd donor. We've achieved some very significant milestones and a high level of buy-in, but we still have a long road ahead of us to institutionalization. And no doubt a few more pivots and a few more adaptations are ahead of us.
And if you could wave a magic wand over this and change something about the dynamics of this that you think would really add to its impact and its utility, what would you focus on?
I think I would echo some of the things that Adanma noted on collaborative approaches to adaptive management. I think I would ask that donors be active partners in navigation and adaptive management with a timeline that enables scaling. I would also ask that government take the time to ensure alignment of these pilots that are intended to scale with regular assessments of what's working and what's not, to ensure that the pilot reaches its outcome destination. I think in both cases, I would also ask both the donors and the government to consider the longer term outcomes of the program rather than the shorter term output of product development, because in scaling, it's necessary to move into program delivery and ensure that the program is delivering. And so evidence-based decision-making is a great support to navigating scaling and reconciling donor and government perspectives, especially for longer-term reform efforts. In many senses, I think my magic wand would reflect much of what Michelle spoke to as well.
Thanks so much. Don't go away, Nejma, because I want to give each one of you, if you would, a chance to react to either what you've heard from all the panelists, just as a group, kind of a sense you have of all this, or to some particular thing that really struck you in what you heard others say. Why don't you go first, if you would?
Thank you. I'm actually struck by what Rob Chase has noted with respect to opportunities for scaling that are brought about by digital solutions and the COVID crisis. In particular, the spread of GSM networks and access, which has been accelerated by COVID, now enables access to populations that are mobile, like refugees, or remote, or that are marginalized. And so it offers a new development paradigm where if development programming can be offered through digital solutions, then it also enables a recalculation of reach and scale of programming. And so certainly COVID has thrown a wrench into our original designs for scaling in the classroom because kids are no longer in the classroom, but in the face of necessity, we are adapting to new COVID delivery mechanisms, which in turn is enabling a scale of reach we didn't anticipate at this point in our scaling journey.
Yeah, how interesting. Michelle, did anything jump out at you?
Yeah, I mean, I love the concept of transitioning accountability to beneficiaries. I think that's a really important concept for us to think about how we can better facilitate that process. And at the same time, it goes to Nejma's point about collaboration being so critical to this. I think if we're really serious about building self-reliance, then that collaboration is critical. But at the same time, I think we have to acknowledge that it makes planning and M&E also more complex, and we have to find ways to solve those problems.
Thanks. Adanma, how about you? What struck you?
Yeah, I think one thing that struck me in in a positive way was first Michelle's point about the need to recognize that there is a degree of adaptability in programming already, and then some of the examples that Nejma gave of how she's doing that in her work. I think that what's really important, because we still find partners who are kind of implementing untested interventions in a non-adaptive way, and obviously, as I said when I was speaking, one of the big problems is the perception that testing and adaptation are difficult to implement and a strain on resources. And so, what I'd love to see is the experiences and techniques of successful examples of adaptability amplified, so that information is out there and useful to organizations that are struggling to make that pivot.
Elaine?
I think it's kind of taking the combination of making systems more responsible to the beneficiaries plus the M&E system, because M&E is really the key to scaling and actually having the evidence of it. And if you can tie it to focusing a little bit more on the beneficiaries and how they're perceiving their receipt of the services, then, and you can do quick surveys and develop M&E systems around the beneficiaries more so than the inputs and the outputs that are coming from the enterprises or organizations, then that might also help scale things up faster.
Interesting. Rob?
Really interesting conversation and lots of things I want to relate to link to. And part of what as we're talking and thinking about sort of accountability to beneficiaries and to results, part of what we really need to do is just build the broadest possible community of innovation and ideas around innovation. And was really impressed with what Adanma was saying about what her group is doing and also Nejma's approaches to doing that. I think that in order for that to happen, that sort of creative fertile ground for innovation, there needs to be the policy space that allows that innovation, one, and two, that allows there to be data collected from that innovation, and that data isn't just collected. I'm an ex-academic who did RCTs. It shouldn't just be randomized controlled designs. It should be sort of trying to use big data and innovations around big data and the collection of data that you can do through digital techniques to try to get that fast feedback and to create those feedback loops as quickly as possible. Larry, there was a question posed to me in the chat. When would you like me to try to answer that?
I'm going to come back to that in just a minute.
Okay, but yeah, but I think that all in all, that need to try to use real-time data collection and creative problem solving, I think it all needs to be based in an environment of trust among several stakeholders, and that trust is going to come out of common goals, the imperative to act, and we hope a vision on accountability to results for beneficiaries.
Thank you very much. Alistair.
Thanks, Larry. What really impressed me is all the innovation that's actually taking place, and I'd really single out the move towards cash transfers, which I'm glad Rob raised. There's been a lot of research on this and ODI on how effective that can be. And I think the accountability to beneficiaries, I think that's also very interesting. But I think there's another side to that, is how the beneficiaries can enforce accountability of the people who are providing them with services, funds, and benefits. And I think when you look at how to manage corruption, creating this demand for good governance is good. I think the overarching question, though, and I'm not sure we've answered it, is how to balance this accountability, particularly fiscal accountability and adaptability. And I think it really requires, it's really about balancing risks, the risks that money disappears where it shouldn't go, and the risk of not achieving impact. And this becomes, I think, a question of how we manage our own internal environments, the political economy, if you like, of our own organizations, or if you like, the aid system. And I would suggest there's a potential model, a way out of this. And one is, as we saw in Sudan and other places, when there's a crisis, there is a willingness of those who manage us to accept greater risk. I noticed this, we had Bosnia, there was the Palestine program of the early 90s, Afghanistan in the early 2000s, there was the Asian tsunami, and now we have COVID. All of these crises create this risk tolerance. And I think that enables adaptation to take place and to be accepted. And I think the real challenge then is when you've got all these ideas, these new practices, people say, well, we can manage these risks. How you transfer that more generally to the countries or the places which aren't at crisis. And I think that transfer, that internal knowledge sharing and learning is one of the key aspects of all this. Thank you.
Yep, thank you. So we have a chat box full of interesting questions, and I have the unenviable task of picking a few of them to go back to you. Maybe if I could ask the tech people to bring us all up now, and let's see if we can't respond as a group to some of these questions. So the first question that I have talks about the fact that sometimes effects take a while to emerge. And is it possible to drink too much of the Kool-Aid about adaptability so that we're just jerking around from response to response and not giving things a chance to really play out? That I think it's an interesting question. I've not heard it posed that way before. Usually the problem is about insufficient adaptation. The questioner is asking, is there any danger in the other direction? That somehow we lose our North Star on this and just are sort of moving in the wind with each contextual difference that happens to emerge. Anybody have a thought on that? If you do, just sort of raise your hand, literally. Yeah, go ahead, Nejma.
Well, I don't think you need to lose your North Star. I think with strategic planning, there's always the destination ahead. And so your North Star needs to remain your North Star, and that's your outcome. But with adaptive management, the how you get there is what will change throughout. And particularly with scaling, new elements are always being introduced. And so the adaptive management and M&E that is associated with that is measuring the process to which or how you get to your destination. And that's where the key is.
I have a question, thanks. I have a question that's pointed quite directly at Michelle and Nejma. Let me ask it. They said we've been talking about M&E about outcomes, but not about scaling strategies. And if we wanted to set up a system that also is looking at how effective we're being at trying to reach scale, or reach scale without losing efficacy, anything that you can point us to that would extend this discussion about adaptive learning to that kind of learning as well. Michelle, why don't you go first, and then I'll go to Nejma.
Yeah, I think that kind of an M&E system looks like you would set up M&E almost for a pilot program, right? It's very iterative, it's very learning focused, and it has some of the characteristics that I talked about, where you need clear objectives, or as Nejma just pointed out, you need a set of clear outcomes. But you also need to think about sort of that management ecosystem. How is information from your M&E system going to flow to your team and your decision makers? And how will they process that information to make appropriate adjustments? So I think it would look smaller. It has to be really focused on the things that matter. And then you have to look at how the team is going to function in response to the information that's coming in, but very much like a pilot program would.
Nejma?
I would definitely agree with what Michelle said. I would just add an additional element of political economy, and to make sure to navigate the political economy so that you are able to reach your final destination as well.
Thanks. I'll abuse the privilege for a second and put on my hat as the chair of the Monitoring and Evaluation Working Group, which is also meeting next week, to say that this is one of the issues we're going to be talking about and clearly at the center of our conversation. So thanks to the questioner for raising it. I have one now that's aimed at Rob and Alistair, and it has to do with the role of national governments in this. And it says, look, in the world where we live, we're trying to reflect and embody a situation where sovereignty is not with the donor institutions. Sovereignty, principal sovereignty, is with the countries where we're operating, which means the governments. Let me take that back, which means the governments plus a lot of other forces in those countries in addition to or around that government. So the question is, who's doing the learning? Who's doing the adapting in this? And to the extent we're talking about this process of learning and adaptation, is there anything more that we could do to either get in line with or stimulate the willingness of governments to do that for their own benefit as well as in the context of the programs we support? Let me go to you, Rob, first, and then Alistair.
Thanks, Larry, and great question. And I think the question of talking about sovereignty and the different ways in which we need to, in some ways, reconceptualize sovereignty without getting too academic about it. It's important to recognize that there are all sorts of ways that sovereignty is being impinged upon, and that many of our World Bank developing country client countries are aware of and concerned about that loss of sovereignty. What we're trying to think about and push for is, just as Alistair said, when he was speaking about sort of the demand for good governance and citizen engagement approaches, what we're trying to think about is changing the mindsets globally of development actors to have that notion of sovereignty. It's the handmaiden of what we were talking about with accountability to beneficiaries and results for beneficiaries. It's to think about having greater sovereignty placed on the citizens and their capacities to achieve what they're looking to achieve, their power, their degree of empowerment. Now, that learning that this great question talks about needs to be sort of directed through political economy mechanisms towards those who have the capacity to make decisions. And part of the challenge of all of our business is figuring out sort of what's the nudge, what's the lever, what's the way in which you can get to the decision makers at a moment. One of the things that I think is important is, again, I feel like I'm spouting all sorts of old cliches. One of them is, let's not let this crisis go to waste, to try to teach some new lessons about how adaptive management, scaling up, learning from failures can lead to people to do things differently.
Alistair, before you respond, let me layer in another question, because I think you and Elaine can respond to that in the context of the way where Rob just left us on this, which is the questioner says, look, we've had learning opportunities before including learning opportunities about the need to be adaptive on this, not least in fragile states, but also in a variety of other contexts. And regrettably, when the crisis was over, we tended to spring back to business as usual. And the question is there anything either that's different about this or something we could do differently in this context that would reduce that tendency so that it's not just a rubber band that springs back to its old position when the provoking situation subsides? Alistair and then Elaine.
Okay, let me just respond quickly to the first question on sovereignties. I mean, the international system really is organized around states that are sovereign, and that's a given. However, in my experience, even within the most awful governments, you usually find elements, maybe a minister, a ministry, department, somewhere that is ready to innovate, to learn, to respond. And I think it's partly identifying partners you can really work with who are willing, and then start to create examples. And quite frankly, most governments want to stay in power. They obviously, you know, who benefits from their action, so on, is an issue. But I don't think that's an impossible question. The other thing too is that aid is inherently political. I mean, there's a really good book by Pablo Yanguas, Why We Lie About Aid. And there's a kind of Heisenberg uncertainty, like the Heisenberg uncertainty principle in physics. If you touch something, you have an impact on it, whether it's the incumbent government or the people who challenge it. So let's not pretend that we are completely apolitical and we're not having impacts, even subtle and sometimes unintended consequences in countries. On the question of how do you prevent things springing back? I mean, I think within, if you like, donor organizations, for lack of a better word, they have their own political economy. They have their, what Andrew Natsios calls their counter bureaucracy, you know, the people who insist on compliance and rules and so on and so forth. So what you have to do is to take the crisis, show that a lot of these rules don't make sense, that the risks are manageable, that there are other techniques that can be used, and then find allies who can institutionalize these. Now, if you've got an organization that refuses to change and adapt, or is constrained by, you know, parliamentary pressures and things, it's tough. But others, you know, do have the flexibility to make changes, to adapt. Because quite frankly, if they don't adapt, they die. I mean, it's a sort of law of biology, and don't take it for granted that the current aid system is going to live forever. You know, it has to adapt. And I think the ideas that have come out this morning suggest ways forward for doing that. And it's about.
And do you think, Alistair, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but to build on Rob's point about not wasting a crisis, do you happen to think this is an opportune moment to push some of these issues?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, the COVID crisis has just transformed the way organizations have worked. I mean, I've seen it in the World Bank. I've been doing some work for the Department of Foreign Affairs in Australia. I mean, they are totally consumed by this crisis, and people are looking for ways of having an impact, because if we don't have an impact, you know, millions of people die. I mean, it's as stark as that.
Elaine, what do you think?
I think, I mean, and I think to some extent, you know, the bank actually has been good about learning from past disasters and pandemics. I mean, we have a component 0 in our project, which allows us to quickly restructure our projects so that we can increase the disbursements into countries whenever there's a crisis that happens. And so I think it's this kind of pre-planning step when you start designing your projects and stuff, where you think, okay, in case there is a situation that comes up or a crisis situation, what is it? How can we be flexible within our planning, within our metrics, so that it kind of becomes a little bit more automatic, so you're not facing that uncertainty about, oh, what can change? What do I still need to be accountable? So I think on that aspect, you know, there's a lot that can be done on the donor side just to improve the processes to account for, you know, these kind of events. On the social enterprise perspective in particular, I think it's also looking at and using this situation as a, you know, an opportunity also to develop more of these public-private partnerships to show the different types of instruments on how to engage with social enterprises, especially if the social enterprises have been effective on the ground. How do you do these results-based financing arrangements, implement them a lot faster, so that the next time around these things can happen. But it's also kind of getting the government used to working it. Like Adama mentioned, they're actually working through a funder rather than directly with the government. But actually it would also be good to start building up that relationship directly with the government so that the government can also recognize that, yes, social enterprises are natural development partners that we can also work with, we can rely on, and we can actually get on the ground much faster if we're working with them. So I think it's building up those ties.
From a USAID perspective on this, I know there's been kind of an on again, off again relationship with things that would open up the space for this kind of work. I remember the conflict modifiers and things of that sort. I remember when you and I did the work in South Sudan, there was a previously unusual, what would have been an unusual level of flexibility. You see anything promising in that regard, or if you want to turn it the other way, anything that a community of practice like ours could do to sort of push the needle on it?
Well, I think there's two things. One is that I agree that COVID has changed things. It really, as I mentioned, creates this openness to these kinds of approaches and ideas. But I also think USAID's focus on self-reliance as a priority requires it, because planning no longer is about planning in your sort of more narrow focused stovepipe. It's really about looking at working with the government, working with local actors. And then you and I saw in South Sudan that trying to change the dynamic to work with other donors to focus on local community resilience required collaboration and different ways of working with one another. And that inherently requires more adaptability as you learn together.
I want to close this segment by making sure that people are really clear that the reason we're having this conversation here in this community of practice is because we've reached the conclusion that that kind of adaptation is absolutely essential for successful scaling. This would be without a crisis in just any normal situation. However, it's proven to be challenging to try and do that, both, and as I said initially, to generate the information and the fora and so on to do it, and now to reduce some of the institutional obstacles and resistance to doing this. So I think, just speaking for myself on this, but it sounds like it's the sentiment of the panel also, it's very important to find very practical ways where we can both increase our own game, improve our own game on this by having real M&E systems or intervention systems or discussion fora, learning partnerships, whatever those happen to be, that help to make this happen and keep up the pressure on the institutions that are finding it most difficult to accommodate this to do that. And I don't see ourselves as an advocacy group, but I do see us as trying to help move the practice on this, and the clearer we can get as a community and how to do that, as I think this morning's conversation has helped us do, the more effective we can be in trying to advance that cause. I want to turn back now to all of you, meaning all of you who haven't had a chance to speak, and ask you a couple of questions, because it will help us figure out where to go from here. And then we're going to end by trying to ask people to be as practical as they can be about suggested next steps. So let me trigger the next couple of poll questions. And so here's the first one. How important, and don't try to just be politically correct on this, really answer what you think. How important is adaptive management to successful scaling? And I'm gonna, don't do anything yet, but I'm gonna ask you with the raise the hand function. I'm gonna say A, and all of you who think A, raise your hand, and then I'll have you put your hands down, and then all who think B, I'll have you raise your hands and put your hands down, and so on. This is just like our upcoming elections. People have to vote. So don't sit it out. Vote for something. And the question here is, how important is adaptive management to successful scaling? Essential, quite important, somewhat important, or not very important? Just pick one. So all of you who think A, essential, please raise your hands. Okay, those hands down. All of you who think it's quite important, please raise your hands. Okay, all of you who think, oh, all of you who think it's somewhat important. All of you who think it's not very important. Okay, so despite what I said, a lot of you didn't vote. So I want to try one more time for all of you who didn't vote. The ones who voted, you're done. For those of you who didn't vote, pick A, B, C, or D and just type that in the chat box. There's a second chance to vote. This is late voting. Any more votes coming in, Katie? Okay. So by an overwhelming proportion, people buy the argument. Either they believed it before this conversation or they're convinced by the conversation that it's essential. That's upwards of 90% of you thought it was essential, and the rest of you thought it was quite important. So I think we're on to something significant from the scaling community's point of view. Let me ask you one more question. So in this case, I want your own sense as to what's the biggest obstacle. Now, these things, these 5 different potential obstacles are not mutually exclusive. They overlap each other a little bit, and they can certainly all be true, or some number of them too, but I want you to pick one. So if you had to say what the biggest single obstacle is, would it be that we still don't have the necessary evidence presented in a timely basis? So people don't have the data that would really lead to and inform decisions. Maybe they could have it, but they don't have it. The second possibility is this delegation of authority issue. The information would be sufficient, but the people who are out there and have access to the decisions don't have the latitude, the discretion to take action based on the information. Third, this issue of accountability to donors, that basically there's a deal that's been struck and there's stewardship on the part of the donor. And that means in order to remain faithful to that contractual or metaphorical contract, we need to sustain commitment to the outputs that we committed to at the outset. That's C. D is that the implementers themselves, that we're all a little bit resistant to change if we tell the truth. And we've been doing it one way for a while, and it's not so easy to pivot, even if the information says we ought to. So it's not just that we can't, it's that if we tell the truth, we're not necessarily so inclined to do that. Or if you think it's something other than that, I'll give you a chance to type that in the chat box. So if you think it's A, please raise your hands. Okay, if you think those hands down. If you think it's B, raise your hand. Okay, hands down. If you think it's C, raise your hand. Okay, if you think it's D, raise your hand. If you think it's something that I didn't put on this list, go ahead and type it in. Okay, thank you all very much. So I've got a couple of interesting observations from your answers on this. About almost half of you thought it was B on this, namely that it's a delegation problem, that we have the information that we need, or at least could have, but the people who are out there don't feel like they have the authority to act on it. A significant number of you, though, thought it was A, C, A or C. A, C, or D, actually. About 6 in the case of some, 7 in the case of others, which is a significant number. And a couple of you opined that you thought it was equally all of it. So I think, and with a couple of you put in other things, like one of you, for example, put in a culture issue, which I'm not sure if the person who put that meant culture on the part of the implementers or culture on the part of the donors, but either way, it's sort of implied in some of the other comments. So that suggests to me that the four, the A, B, C, D, namely evidence, delegation, accountability, and reluctance on this is a pretty good array of constraints. And if we're serious about trying to move this forward, we're working on some combination of those issues, maybe beginning with the one that most of you rated, which is the delegation issue. Let's turn to just one last piece of this agenda for today. We've got about 20 minutes left, and I want to ask the panelists for one last chance to just opine, in this case, about what you think the development community in general and the COP in particular can do moving forward. I think we've got a pretty good sense about where the problem is. We've had some good articulations of possibilities. We think we may have a pregnant moment right now. What do we do with it? And how do we channel that energy in the most constructive possible way? And I want to, at the same time as I'm asking the panelists to do that, I want to ask all of you who are online to do exactly the same thing in the chat box. We're not going to have a chance to respond to your comments during this session, but we really want them because that's our guidance for how we go forward as a community on this, and we'd like to hear from as many of you as possible. We're also going to leave the chat box open for about 10 minutes after the session for any of you who have additional thoughts and want to put them in. I promise you we're going to read these with great interest. So please do take a moment to share your own thoughts while I ask the panelists for theirs. I think maybe I'll start this time. I didn't forewarn people, but I'll start in the middle of the panel. Let me, Elaine, if you don't mind, I'll start with you for just a kind of a final thought about the way forward on all of this.
Okay, so I think in terms of the development community, I think, working on M&E systems and helping to support the implementation of rapid M&E systems is actually quite important, as well as kind of facilitating more collaborative networks especially for social enterprises to be more connected into the system. With respect to the community of practice, what they can do, there's a lot of great innovations that are coming out of social enterprises that would actually be beneficial for government systems to improve how they deliver services. So I think the more we can help facilitate those ties, the more we're in touch with social enterprises that are on the ground and kind of make the ties to the government or other funders and collaborators. That would also be helpful.
Thank you very much. Adanma?
Sorry, lost you briefly there. Yes, so you asked for closing thoughts, correct?
Yes.
Yeah, no, I think it's been, I really enjoyed being on this call and hearing a bit more about what other people are doing in this space. I think my sort of major thought, and I'd actually like to follow up with some of the panelists from today, is just gathering a little bit more evidence of what's been done in this space and thinking about how we can begin to disseminate and make it easier for implementers to begin to apply some of these principles in their work.
Thanks so much. Alistair? Alistair?
Yeah, I think in terms of how we practically move forward, I think the work that the community of practice does is about sharing knowledge, encouraging learning across different policy communities, organizations, really valuable. Because I think today we heard a lot of ideas about innovations and things that are taking place and how we can disseminate them is good. I think the second thing is this whole issue of showing that that risks can be managed. This trade-off, if you like, between fiduciary risks and the risks of achieving outcomes. And I think it's again showcasing good practice, encouraging people to learn from each other, and even how people manage their own organizations, their own the constraints they feel under, to find a ways around, and also to be able to take the COVID crisis and learn from that, and hopefully take some of these lessons and permanently institutionalize them in our organizations.
Thank you very much. Nejma.
Thank you, Larry. Yeah, I think with respect to collaboration and experimentation, I think that the COVID crisis has put us in an experimental mode, and thus it does require collaboration and partnership that recognizes the journey that is scaling. And so working on adaptive melt systems to enable pivots would be great. My major thought is, how can we build accountability? And that accountability should not only extend to beneficiaries, but also government and donors to achieving outcomes. And that will also engender a collaborative approach if we do work towards that together.
Thank you very much. Rob?
I agree with what all my esteemed colleagues have said, so very little to add. I think that the idea of learning as much as we can, creating an environment where it's okay to talk about innovations, even those that didn't work, and that safe space of sort of a common objective, but also a frank discussion, and trust that frank discussion about what works and what doesn't is crucial. And I think that's a huge role that this community of practice can play and should continue to play. I think that I like the idea of trying to change the narrative about accountability to results for beneficiaries, and that using the COVID crisis at the moment to change, play with that idea, see whether or not it works, and then ultimately to try to work some of the political economy channels that I'm sure many of us are involved with to use that narrative to try to change some of these constraints that we've been talking about.
Thanks so much. Michelle?
Yeah, just building on what my colleagues have said, I think Elaine's idea of really challenging ourselves to build more iterative, learning focused kinds of monitoring, evaluation, and learning systems that can adapt more quickly than they have in the past, take advantage of the technologies we talked about, I think will be crucial. Secondly, I think it is really important to share practical, tangible examples of where people have done this. There's nothing as powerful as when an organization can say, we've done this successfully. And I think publicizing those kinds of cases. And then third, to have the kinds of fora like this to really talk about these ideas is really important. And I know I've learned a lot today in this panel from my colleagues as well. So I think continuing that moving forward will be important.
Well, I can say that as a community of practice, it's exactly for what we exist. I mean, this is at the center of what we're trying to do. It's one of the things that Johannes and I had very much in mind when we set this up some years ago was that it wouldn't be owned by anyone. It really is a community of practice. There's no donor for it. There are a couple of sponsors who help out, but they do that just the way people support National Public Radio. Basically, it's a public good, and it's there for anyone who wants to use it. It's only as good as the members, but it's there to debate and discuss exactly these kinds of things. And I think, maybe I delude myself, but I think it gives us some credibility when we speak to donors, because we don't have a dog in the fight. We're really just trying to pull together the best thinking we can on some of these issues and put it forward in a way that's useful. That depends on those of you who are on the call, and even the ones who aren't, really contributing their ideas and their experience on this, because it's a true community of practice. There's no paid staff, there's no nothing. I mean, it's really just as strong or as weak as what people contribute to it. And that's what you saw in action today. And it's what I hope on our best days you see in action in the community more generally. So for those of you who weren't members before, I hope this will inspire you to stay involved with both the community as a whole and with the individual working groups, the ones that happen to speak to your interests. If you haven't already signed up to participate in some of the working group meetings next week that I mentioned one, Elaine mentioned one, Rob mentioned one, all 9 are having meetings next week in blocks of 3. So on Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, you can choose one of 3 during each of those blocks. Please do. The registration for that is open through the middle of the afternoon Eastern time today. So if you haven't yet signed up, there's still time to do that. And if you miss that window and you still want to do that, let one of us know and we'll find a way to make sure that you're included. We really want you. Second thing I wanted to say by way of ending comment on this is that we've recorded these sessions and we're going to make that available on the website at the address that I mentioned earlier, www.scalingcommunityofpractice.com, which goes live on next Friday. And that same website is intended to be a place for all of you to post anything you think might be useful. It's one of the limitations of the current community of practice that essentially people send things into us, we digest them, and we try our best in the newsletters to get things back out to you. We're going to keep doing that, but we know that's not as interactive or as multi-sided as the conversation should be. So our intention in setting up the website is exactly to overcome that constraint. Again, it only works if you use it. So each one of the working groups in the overall community of practice will have a page on the website identifying things that come to our attention, but equally encouraging you to post things there that come to your attention. And finally, the newsletter itself. We're going to continue the newsletter because we don't think a website entirely replaces that. And so each quarter we'll send around to all of you who are now on our list this quarterly newsletter, which is composed of 2 things. It's composed of anything that you all send us, which usually takes the form of a paragraph describing something and a link for more information about it. Plus, each time we include some number of special features, like blog length special features about something that we think might be of general interest. The next newsletter, which will be coming out soon, will also include a summary of these 2 weeks, the various sessions that took place during these 2 weeks. So if you're interested, that's another way you can kind of keep in touch with all of this. If all of that fails, use that community of practice at MSI email address that I gave you earlier. That'll get to me and to the other people who stand behind this community of practice, and we'll be sure and get back to you. We really, really, really want you to participate. And we thank you for doing that today. And I most especially want to thank the 6 panelists who did just a beautiful job, in my opinion, of trying to lay out a difficult issue in all its complexity, but with exactly the kind of optimism and promise that I hope the rest of you feel. Thank you all very much for today's session. Goodbye.
Thank you.